So, recently I've been talking about Sonic a lot. If you missed them, I've made videos on the 4 classic Sonic games and gave all the reasons, probably including many that others have already given, I must admit, why I thought they were not only really good games, but also unforgettable experiences. From day one, Sonic has always been a series that prides itself on making an impact on its players, expanding and growing with each and every game. If you're in the future watching these videos back to back or something, you're probably sick of hearing me say that over and over, but I really want to make it clear how impactful this series wanted to be. It was central to Sonic's identity to push the boundaries and stand out, especially with the tidal wave of imitators that would follow in the wake of the series' success. And if you ask me, I think the series succeeded in its goal. It succeeded in creating a cool character with a neat world, as well as taking its unique gameplay concepts to the next level as the series progressed. Sonic CD was the exception, which I found to be just kind of okay, but if we're strictly speaking of the Genesis titles, they came together as one of the best examples of a perfect gaming trilogy. You know, the first game introduces a thing, the second one fixes its issues, and the third one refines it to a T. I've just played those Genesis Sonic games so many times because they're awesome experiences for me. That being said, they were not the only Sonic things to re-release during this era. Sega really wanted this Hedgehog to be a household name, and what's the one way to grow a character's influence? Expanding their horizons into other avenues. Cartoons, comic books, action figures, and of course, spin-off games to complement the main course. Namely, those on platforms like the Game Gear, Sega's foray into the handheld market to compete with Nintendo's Game Boy. Now, if you're familiar with the handheld gaming market, the notion of any company challenging the big N is laughable, but in a time when Sega was on top of the world, they had some legitimate competition. The Game Gear was a moderate success, and even had some perks over the Game Boy, like a backlit screen and actual color, but at the cost of consuming battery power like nobody's business, which was ultimately one of the factors that did it in, alongside a perceived, and I want to make that clear, perceived lack of worthwhile software. The exception to this was, of course, the Sonic games the platform received. While not as revered as their Genesis counterparts, these games still have their fans. Honestly though, I've never really played any of them. I would always start them up, make my way through a few levels, get bored, and then shut the game off and go do something else. I've never found them very interesting, and so haven't had a desire to see what they really have in store. Same thing goes for the Sonic spin-offs from this era released on other platforms, including like the Genesis and the other Sega add-ons. Well, now that I'm doing videos on this series, I don't see why not. Thing is though, there's a whole lot of Sonic games on the Game Gear alone, almost double the amount that's on the Genesis in fact, and only about half of them fit the criteria I laid out for this retrospective at the start. I'm into Sonic for the platformers, since those are the core of the series and what I've spent the most amount of time on, whereas the Game Gear has stuff like Sonic Spinball or Sonic Drift. Games I feel I would have very little to say about because they kind of speak for themselves, so I'm limiting my coverage somewhat. I'm not completely opposed to playing those spin-offs from other genres someday, just not now. So, why don't we get into it? What do these supplementary Sonic platformers have to offer? Getting into the first 8-bit Sonic game, called, well, Sonic the Hedgehog. Can I just say, I don't care for when different games share titles like that. It just causes confusion and makes it so you have to specify which game you're talking about with fan-made subtitles, like Sonic 1 8-bit for this game or whatever. I guess it makes sense for reboots, but for the love of God, can you guys please pick distinct titles for your games? I get it's hard to think of a good name for something, but still. That elongated nitpick aside, getting into this game, the thing that stands out to me immediately is how they were able to pull off what they did. I mean, Sonic speed was so tied to the power of the Genesis, even being a huge part of the marketing for that system, and yet here Sega goes producing something comparable on hardware with a CPU clocked at less than half its speed. I mean, just take a look at this. Yeah, speaks for itself, doesn't it? Unfortunately though, I don't think Sonic controls particularly well in this game. It's hard to explain because his handling is more or less the same on paper to the Genesis version, but the devil's in the details here. Control is something you feel, so I can't really quantify it, but to me, Sonic feels more slippery and floaty here than in the Genesis games, which leads to more falling into bottomless pits. It gets especially annoying in Jungle Zone Act 2, where the game pulls a Contra and makes everything that scrolls off the screen in a bottomless pit, making it so the slightest mistake leads to your demise. Well, on the Master System version at least. Oh yeah, which reminds me, you may notice most of my footage has these weird colored bars all over the screen, and that's because I played the Master System version. If you want to play this game, that's the one I'd recommend. I'm pretty sure it runs at PAL 50Hz, since every release of this version is technically the European one, but I'd still say it's the one you should play. Side note, but the Master System was actually region-free, so that's cool. However, I'd say it's worth it for the greater resolution, because like the Genesis games, Sonic 1 for 8-bit systems suffers from screen crunch, except to a greater degree. That may just be because I'm way more familiar with the level design and hazard placement of the Genesis titles, but even still, I don't recall having nearly as many instances of this on my first playthroughs of those games 5 years ago. On Game Gear, it's even worse. I zoomed in on the footage so it fills the screen, since by default it looks like this. I can barely see where the hell I'm going in this version, so Master System it is. Even then, that version still has camera issues, so yeah. For whatever reason though, the Game Gear one actually has more stable performance, because good lord can the frame rate really chug on the Master System. It gets particularly bad in Labyrinth Zone, because that's a level everyone wanted to come back, where Sonic moves even slower underwater than he did on Genesis. Really, in a lot of ways, this game de-emphasizes speed much more than the Genesis version already did. I know I praised how quickly Sonic can move on such ancient hardware, but that example in Green Hill was one of the few moments with Sonic-like speeds. The rest of the game plays out like a more traditional platformer, even featuring an auto-scroller at one point. Now, I don't want to make it come off like I hate slower, more traditional platforming or whatever, because I don't. Case in point, that 17 video long retrospective I made explaining why I love Mario so much. However, when talking about Sonic, I come to this series for its own unique appeal of speedy platforming, not for that more deliberate Mario style stuff. I'd go play a Mario game if I wanted that. So as a result, most of the level design kinda goes in one ear and out the other for me. It comes off as a bit bland, only really standing out with things that I thought totally sucked. For example, the slow and annoying Labyrinth Zone, or the pure frustration of Skybase Act 2 with its lack of rings and irritating hazards. I also hate the bosses because they too have no rings. Once you have the patterns down, they're pretty easy, but the lack of rings just makes them so needlessly punishing for newcomers in my opinion. I just didn't have fun with them. The fatal flaw being that, yet again, this game has limited continues. Granted, this game is way shorter than 16-bit Sonic 1 and 2, so there's way less you have to do if you fuck up. But for a game with instances of heavy trial and error like this, it comes off as pretty cheap, especially since getting hit only drops one ring that's nearly impossible to pick up, no matter your ring count. It may sound like I totally hated this game to some with all the complaining I just did, but that's really not the case. I think it has strengths of its own, like visuals and art design that are decently appealing despite their simplicity, special stages that are well above playable and offer a solid chance to earn lives and continues, and I even thought the idea of finding Chaos Emeralds in the stages themselves was a neat concept, even if I can't be bothered to go for all of them. Also, if nothing else, the soundtrack is super catchy. You have a decent epic rendition of Green Hill, a track for Labyrinth that runs circles around the one from the Genesis original, and of course, Bridge Zone. Also, when I beat the game and heard this, that awesome menu music I praised in the Sonic Forever fan port was actually a remix of the track from this game. That's so cool to me. I also love how Eggman maniacally laughs during the final boss. I think this game has plenty of things going for it, and despite how frustrated I got at some parts of it, I can say it was a generally fine experience. It's just that when it comes to gameplay, the things this game does well have more or less been done much better in other Sonic games I've covered at this point. The game is alright. Not anything unplayable, crappy, or even all that bad. You can totally survive a playthrough of it, but it's also not something I'll likely remember much, or play it again anytime soon, for that matter. In fact, I would probably play Sonic CD again before this game, because even though I also criticized that game for instances of sloppy level design, I found it overall more memorable and Sonic handled better there for me. This game is middle of the road for me. A solid C-tier experience, if you will. If you like the main games, there's no harm in playing this one too. However, I certainly can't say the same thing about 8-bit Sonic 2. I played this game for an hour and ended up throwing in the towel because I honestly couldn't take it anymore. Put simply, I really didn't like this one. That's not to say that it has absolutely nothing going for it, and there were a handful of things I liked. I think the game's first level is really standout for classic Sonic. All these games started out in some sort of bright green paradise, which I always thought looked pretty gorgeous in each game, but here we're in a place reminiscent of Marble Zone, with underground ruins, lava, and moving set pieces. I generally find the visuals in this game to be a step down from the previous one, with ugly colors and unappealing sprite work, but this first zone is the exception. Similarly, while I also find the music immensely forgettable, the theme for Green Hills Zone, and yes, I said Green Hills Zone, one letter makes it new, I guess, is extremely good. And as you can hear, this game features the melody for the Japanese theme of Sonic CD, You Can Do Anything. Except, it came out a year before that game, so technically that song is a remix of this one. So that's cool. Alright, what else? This one's Seal Boss bounces Sonic like a ball, that's kinda cute. Also, Tails technically makes his debut in this game, so... yeah, there's that. And, that's it. Those are all the things I liked about this game. Alright, positivity over. Where do I even begin with this one? Well, how about the fact this game still has limited continues? And way fewer chances to earn them, to the point I actually didn't get a single one throughout this entire game. Again, this game's really short, and like the other Sonic games that I have this issue with, I wouldn't say it's game ruining on its own because of that. No, the real problem begins when you start to look at the rest of the game, which, let's just say, isn't particularly pleasant. To put it nicely. For one, Sonic's controls are still slippery. He's again capable of traveling fairly quick, but the actual movement makes him feel like he's on ice or something. A major pain in the ass when the levels are packed to the brim with spikes and bottomless pits. In general, I hate the level design in this game. It's either really bland and features almost nothing going on, or a frustrating chore. Many have annoying stage gimmicks like these godforsaken bubbles that pop if one of their pixels even slightly grazes a wall in an Aqua Lake Zone, or the infamous hang gliders in Sky High Zone that everyone who's played this game knows about. The latter actually didn't necessarily give me much trouble, because the gliders control almost the same as the cape feather from Super Mario World, but even then I didn't find it fun or satisfying or anything like that. Hell, one of the later stages is even literally called, and I'm not making this up, Gimmick Mountain Zone, as if it wasn't blatant enough already. Additionally, this game slips up on the most basic elements of game design. For one, it's possible that you could be screwed with progression. In the Game Gear version, I came across this one wall that, no matter how many times I rolled into it, it would not break, and there's no spin dash in this game. It worked just fine on the Master System, but for whatever reason, the Game Gear version was broken here. Not sure if it was an emulator thing, but either way, that's really bad. It's not just a thing on Game Gear though. In many cases, this game has blatantly poor design, or at least oversights in its level design that make it a chore for me. Take, for example, these clouds in Sky High Zone. You're able to stand on some of them, but others you fall straight through. There is no distinction between which clouds are in the foreground and which are in the background. They both look the same, which is really fun to deal with when you have spikes below you. Speaking of which, screw the spikes in this game. No invincibility frame ignoring bug in this one, but when you take a hit from a spike, Sonic gets launched high in the air and takes forever to fall back down, making it nearly impossible to recover your dropped rings. I mean, credit where it's due, getting hit does cause multiple rings to scatter around, so it's actually conceivable to recover a few, but that doesn't mean much when you're essentially prevented from moving after taking a hit anyways. Which, by the way, speaking of rings, the bosses in this game still have none, and in some instances it's possible to have the knockback from hitting them bounce you into one of their projectiles. I hate that shit. I don't understand why these 8-bit Sonic games feel the need to arbitrarily just take away your rings for the boss fights. Also, why do some games have absurd knockback like this? To be harder? Well, I think it's a really shitty way to add extra difficulty, since it's hardly tied to skill. Like limited continues, it doesn't necessarily make the game any harder, just more punishing and annoying, especially when combined with the lack of rings. And sure, the Genesis games also had a mild case of knockback, both from damage and hitting a boss, but at least there it wasn't so absurd that you'd be constantly thrown into boss's attacks or into a hazard below, because the controls and movement physics felt good there. Look, I don't need every 2D Sonic game to be a perfect recreation of the original Genesis controls, but on its own, I don't like how this game handles, and that's pretty much it. On top of that, this game has one of the worst cases of screen crunch I've ever seen. Especially on the Game Gear, the screen size makes it pretty much unplayable. The Master System version's greater resolution eliminates some of this horizontally, but vertically, it's about as bad. Section after section of blind sides, which come as a result of enemy and hazard placement that doesn't gel with the absurdly small screen size. Those aforementioned spikes are the absolute worst in this regard, namely in Green Hills Act 3. It's a boss level, so you get no rings. So what do? Make this level an onslaught of springs where you have to land perfectly to avoid spikes that are impossible to see before it's too late. I died over and over and over and over again this lazy, ill-conceived idea for a stage. The only way to make it through this tedious nightmare unscathed is to go through a bothersome amount of trial and error to perfectly memorize where all the spikes and springs are. Because that's how you make fun games, right? At the end, you encounter the stupid boss that plays like shit with Sonic's poor control, and if you die on it, back to the start of the spike nightmare you go. This section is just a lives drainer. When I got a game over on this stage, meaning I'd have to restart the whole thing, yeah, fuck that, I'm done. I put this game down because I wasn't enjoying it at all. Honestly, this game sucks. I think it's a piece of crap. I know some people like it, and that's perfectly fine. More power to them. Everything I say in these videos is just my personal opinion, and it's not my intent to take people's enjoyment away when I don't like a game they did. So if you like the 8-bit version of Sonic 2, keep on liking it. I'm glad you were able to find joy in a game that I didn't. That being said, this game was downright miserable for me. Unlike Sonic 1 and 2 on the Genesis, which featured enough design strengths for me to have tons of fun in spite of the limited continues and occasional irritating enemy placement, this game was just frustrating and I had no fun with it. Even discounting its bullshit design elements that were infuriating to no end, I just find the gameplay tedious and boring, with really bland, forgettable, and shallow levels. You may say that it's because the game is on an 8-bit system, so the design is kind of limited, but to that, I would counter with Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES, or hell, Super Mario Land 2 on the monochromatic Game Boy for that matter. These games had a surprising amount of nuance to their levels and gameplay, despite their much weaker hardware, so the hardware excuse kind of falls flat for me. Personally, it all comes down to poor decisions if you ask me. I mean, for Christ's sake, I couldn't even be arsed to finish it, and I'm the guy who beat both Size Matters and Agent Clank. I'm never touching this game again, and that's all I have to say about it. So, what about Sonic Chaos? Well, I'll just get it out of the way immediately. It's better than 8-bit Sonic 2. Like the first game, I managed to beat this one, or rather had enough tolerance to play it to the end at least. I still think Sonic handles poorly as he does in the other games, but hey, they actually added the spin dash, and playable tails. The spin dash does help considerably, namely with those sections that have breakable walls or slopes. Makes the game feel like, you know, a Sonic title, and not just a Mario clone with a slightly higher top speed. The pieces are there for a decent handheld Sonic experience, but unfortunately, I don't really think it sticks the landing. For one, it's comically handholdy to an almost absurd degree. There must have been complaints about the 8-bit version of Sonic 2 being too punishing, so they gave Sonic Chaos an abundance of lives and continues. You get to continue for every 50,000 points you earn, including the end of level time bonus, which is measured in kilometers per hour for some bizarre reason. Now, I'm not great at physics, but even I know that time is not measured in units of speed, but I seriously digress. On top of that, collecting 100 rings in a stage doesn't give you an extra life. Instead, you're sent to this game's take on special stages. You fly around with these rocket shoes, because that's a power-up in this game, and collect a bunch of floating rings. Kinda reminds me of those bonus areas in Super Mario World, come to think of it. Except here, you're able to rack up lives like nobody's business, because there's a bunch of these large rings that give you 10 rings each. This was the only 8-bit Sonic game I got upwards of 20 lives in. That may seem excessive, but to be quite frank, I would much rather take this over the alternative, since again, this game has no save feature or password system. Great. 3 8-bit games in, and they're still relying on this dated design philosophy. At least the game is pretty short once again, being beatable in less than an hour, because if you ask me, this is one of the most schizophrenic Sonic games I've ever played, featuring some of the most inconsistent level design in the series. I may have criticized Sonic CD for spaghetti level design, but I would take that over this. In most cases, I find the levels utterly forgettable. Many barely even last a minute, in fact. There aren't nearly as many haphazardly placed enemies and hazards, or tangled pathways as there were in CD, but most of the time you can blast through a level before it can even get going. More than once, I would find myself asking, wait, that's it? If you end up reaching the special stage, the levels are even shorter, since you're sent to this next stage when it ends. So basically, you can either reach the goal ring, which usually takes 1 minute to do, or collect 100 rings, which, again, takes about a minute or so. How exciting. Sonic Chaos easily gets my vote for the most forgettable level roster in the series, at least so far. And when it does stand out, it does so for all the wrong reasons. This game may mostly be Sonic for babies, but there's other times where some more that 8-bit Sonic 2-esque bullshit comes out. Poorly placed hazards that actively fight against the low resolution aren't uncommon, so again, the Master System version is the way to go, but even then, the issue still exists. In addition, there's so many instances where you'll be thrown into unpredictable bottomless pits. In Mecha Green Hill Zone, this is especially apparent. Hell, there's even this one moving platform that will crush you, unless you somehow intuit that the ceiling above it is breakable. Yeah, cause that's obvious, right? Thankfully, the stockpile of lives and continues you're given should be enough to counteract all this fuckery, but it nonetheless makes for some pretty stinky lows, and is only doubly jarring given how simple this game is otherwise. For most of this game's runtime, it's stupidly easy, but other times the difficulty will spike up ludicrously at random, and I have no idea why. You'll play one stage that's easy, then go to one filled to the brim with death traps, then back to an easy one. I do not understand this at all. Were these 8-bit Sonic games just not given enough playtesting or something? I mean, seriously, how else would the 4th zone be the hardest in the entire game, and then immediately be followed by the easiest? The same thing applies to the boss fights. Some are extremely trivial, whereas others will gobble up your lives like nobody's business. I'm glad you're actually given rings for the fights at the very least, even on the final boss. But even without them, most of these fights would be hilariously easy. In fact, I only died once in the final boss, because I missed these ring capsules hidden in this pipe. Meanwhile, this gigantic caterpillar is a pain in the ass, because its attacks come at you ridiculously fast. Same thing for the stupid bouncing Eggman mech. Sonic's controls are just not responsive enough for such annoying attacks, at least if you ask me. Really, a lot of the stuff about this game feels slapdash. I think the art design is uninspired, I guess with the exception of Gigopolis and Mecha Green Hill, and the soundtrack was even more forgettable than 8-bit Sonic 2. I don't remember a single track from this entire game, which really sucks because the music has always been one of Sonic's strongest aspects. Special mention goes to Aqua Planet Zone though. Oh god, turn it off. Oh. feel like I'm gonna throw up. I don't really know what else to say. Sonic Chaos is definitely better than 8-bit Sonic 2, but that's not saying much. That's a really low bar to clear, and to be quite frank, I don't consider being better than some past failure to necessarily be a point in the game's favor. I would play it in a heartbeat over that piece of crap, but on its own, I find it painfully mediocre at its very best. At times, it also tends to delve into asinine design that seems intent on giving newcomers as much shit as they can get away with, without becoming entirely unplayable. It may seem like I was pretty harsh on this game, but like 8-bit Sonic 1, that's because everything it does well has pretty much already been done in other Sonic games, except better. I'm not gonna sit here expecting a Sonic 3 and Knuckles tier experience from these Game Gear and Master System games, because that would be incredibly unfair. But in the case of Sonic Chaos in particular, I think they could have put in at least a little more effort, you know? I legitimately played it 4 hours ago at the time of writing this, finishing the game in 54 minutes, and yet I hardly remember anything notable about it beyond the things I took issue with. Out of all these 8-bit Sonic games, this one feels the most like filler to me. If I ever play it again for whatever reason, it probably won't be for a very long time. I would only recommend this game to other people who want to play as many Sonic games as they can. Otherwise, you can safely skip this one. However, you know what game I wouldn't recommend skipping? Why, it's none other than the last 8-bit Sonic game.
Kind of.
Sonic Triple Trouble. Yeah, no memes, this one was actually pretty good. Well, at least by the standards of 8-bit Sonic anyway. In comparison to the other games in this series, it's not this mind-blowing experience that's taken the series to the next level, but out of all these Game Gear or Master System titles, it's the only one I can say stands head and shoulders with the console games. At the very least, it's a solid side experience. As opposed to the other 8-bit Sonic games, which all had a Master System port alongside their handheld versions, Sonic Triple Trouble was built from the ground up as a Game Gear exclusive. Because of this, it feels like the game was designed with a smaller screen in mind. That's right, I easily had the least amount of visibility issues out of all the 8-bit Sonic games in this one. Now, that's not to say it's perfect. There's still a couple instances of vertical blindsides, including from enemies, spikes, bottomless pits, or other hazards. The pits in particular become a nuisance in the later levels, which in some ways seem to fall back on cheap, arbitrary bullshit a lot of the time. When this game gets frustrating, it really does, much like 8-bit Sonic 1. Not helping matters is the fact that even in 1994, after both halves of Sonic 3 and Knuckles were out, Triple Trouble still has limited continues and boots you back to the title screen upon getting a game over. It really sucks that this is the case, because otherwise, I find this game has a lot in store to enjoy. For one, the ring system has seen an overhaul. When you get hit, you actually only drop a fraction of your rings rather than all of them. You have no idea how much that would have helped in the other games, seriously, but I'm glad it's here. That's not something I would be opposed to happening in other Sonic games, to be honest. There's also a bunch of opportunities to use Sonic's speed in cool ways, including spin dash jumps to higher areas. Yeah, that's something I only occasionally pull off in the Genesis games, and yet there were a few instances I pulled it off in Triple Trouble despite never playing it before. In general, I don't know if it's just me, but Sonic feels like he controls ever so slightly more smooth. I guess he's still a bit slippery, but I honestly barely noticed. In the past few games, it wasn't uncommon for you to slip and fall into a pit or something, but here that happens a lot less frequently, because the levels felt much better optimized for that. The platforming was entirely doable this time around, even with the Game Gear's limitations, and because of this I was more inclined to look around for hidden extra lives or rings. In general, there's all sorts of hidden item boxes to incentivize exploring a bit, as well as higher paths that are harder to stay on but tighten up your run of a stage. Chaos summons are also still hidden around the stage, providing even more of a reason to explore if you'd like. I didn't get all of them, or actually apparently none of them, because I looked up footage and apparently you're supposed to jump in this ring that appears when you hit a Chaos Emerald monitor. Whoops. But I did manage to track down at least a few here and there. Weirdly enough, I don't think this game has special stages to earn more lives. I don't know, at the very least I couldn't find any.
Because I'm a fucking idiot.
I wish it did have them though. I topped out at 6 lives, and as I said when talking about the earlier games, having a 1-digit life count and limiting continues make it so my mind focuses on that rather than the actual design while playing a lot of the time. I find games way less stressful if they at least give ample chances to earn lives, which, outside of exploring, Sonic Triple Trouble doesn't really do. I can't complain too much, because it's very much possible to earn lives if you're careful and look around, but I still would have liked some sort of bonus stage that lets you earn them. Coolest of all, though, is the neat ideas and set pieces that the game has. The Rocket Shoes power-up makes a return from Sonic Chaos, but alongside that is the snowboard, which is more fleshed out than it was in Sonic 3 and K, the scuba gear, the train you jump on, and these floating water bubbles that don't instantly pop at the slightest touch to a wall or ceiling anymore. Some set pieces got on my nerves, namely these air currents and Robotnik Winter that pretty much instantly kill you with a pit if you don't use them correctly. But outside of those infrequent moments, I actually find it possible to appreciate this game's design this time around. In addition to that, you still earn continues for every 50,000 points you earn, so getting them still shouldn't be much of a hassle. And the bosses don't make me want to flip a chair anymore. Well, most of the time anyway. Not to mention you can also play as Tails, there's occasional zone transitions with Knuckles that make the game feel more interconnected, Metal Sonic makes a return for a boss near the end, and there's even a new character named Fang the Sniper. Yeah, check that out, a Game Gear spin-off introduced a new face to the series. Isn't that cool? I also find the visuals far more appealing than any other 8-bit Sonic game. With neat art design and a fair amount of detail, the soundtrack still doesn't top the first game as far as Game Gear Sonic goes, but it's fine in its own right. The one really dumb thing I noticed about this game though is that the checkpoint boxes marked with a down arrow, after you respawn at one you have to hit them again, otherwise you'll be sent back to the beginning of the level after you die. I have no idea why these Game Gear Sonic games do that. Like, is it so hard to record in memory that you hit a checkpoint and just, keep it that way? These are like the only games I've seen that have done that. I don't get it. But regardless, that's all I got on Sonic Triple Trouble. I thought it was the best of the 8-bit Sonic titles, and actually had a fair bit of fun with it. It wasn't some amazing masterpiece, but for what it does, it's pretty good. Sure, it still falls into some common pitfalls these games occasionally do, quite literally in many cases, and the checkpoints work really strangely, which made for some frustrating moments as a newcomer, but I found that the fun moments greatly outweigh the frustrating ones. Sonic controlled better, although that may just be me. The level design was far more refined, and in general it feels like much more effort was put into this one. Triple Trouble manages to be a quality companion to the Genesis titles, and it's the only one of the 8-bit games I can see myself revisiting someday, or at least relatively soon. Also, you'd better believe I'm gonna play the 16-bit fan remake of this game at some point. If you're into Sonic just like me, I would recommend it, whether on the Game Gear or the unofficial Master System port created by fans. In other words, if Sonic 1 8-bit was a C-tier game, this is a definite B-tier. Not the best thing ever, but a solid experience all the same. One that's definitely worth playing. So that's all the 8-bit games. However, like I said earlier, the Game Gear and Master System weren't the only consoles to receive supplemental Sonic platformers. The Genesis also got a few, including with another add-on for the system. So do you remember the Sega CD? Well, its release marked the point where Sega more or less stopped making educated business decisions. They had done so well with the Genesis up to that point, with a genius marketing campaign and whatnot, but like I went into in the Sonic CD video, their reliance on additional hardware for new software made consumers lose trust in them, especially at the speed they were released. Many just decided that the SNES was a better deal, and so it was able to overtake the Genesis' sales by 1994. Only making things worse for the company was the release of another Genesis add-on, the 32X, and my god what a disaster it was for them. If you want a more in-depth look at why the 32X failed, I would suggest Gaming Historian's video on the topic, but long story short, it was a victim of the Osborne effect. Sega announced this new 32-bit add-on, but shortly afterwards also announced the Saturn, their next system, which effectively killed the 32X. The thing was this ugly mushroom cloud abomination you attached onto the Genesis's cartridge slot, something the marketing made 1,000,000% clear by, So setting the thing up is also a pain because it needs its own power cable, and you have to connect it to the Genesis with an extra cable, otherwise the sprite layers won't show up. Worst of all, there's barely any games on the thing. Sure, it got some heavy hitters like Doom,
In theory.
but besides that, pretty much nothing. That is, if you ignore the sole Sonic game the thing received. The 32X would get its own exclusive entry from the series in 1995, as the Sega CD did with Sonic CD 2 years prior. And like that game, it wouldn't quite follow the exact formula that had been built up in the Genesis trilogy. For one, Knuckles was the star of the show, and alongside him is a group of new characters known as the Chaotix, including Vector the Crocodile, Espio the Chameleon, Charmy Bee, and Mighty the Armadillo from the arcade game Sega Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay, sure. Together they make up the cast of the 32X's Sonic offering, Knuckles' Chaotix. Or Knuckles Chaotix, I don't know. Much like Sonic CD, this game would be seen as a lost classic of sorts, due to the fact it's barely been re-released. This has left it as a curious game in the series, and those who have played it seem very mixed. So where do I sit on the matter? Yeah, I think this game kinda sucks. It's a shame too, because the game's presentation is actually quite good. The sprites are decently detailed, the color palette is striking, and while I find the art design a little uninspired, the music certainly isn't. It sounds like the next step from the Genesis games, right before the CD quality audio from, well, Sonic CD. I can say several things about Knuckles' Chaotix, but what I can't say is that it has poor aesthetics. Now then, what's not to like about this game? Well, personally, I think it's flawed from its very inception. Around this time, Sega had developed a demo known as Sonic Crackers, in which you play as Sonic and Tails tethered to one another with a rope they're holding. Knuckles' Chaotix sees this idea being turned into a full-fledged game. You can hold a button to stretch the rope and send yourself flying, and use it to reach incredibly blazing speeds. I have mixed feelings towards this. On the one hand, it's impressive how quick the characters are able to move. The 32X's extra processing power was clearly put to use to achieve this, and in spite of some dropped frames every now and then when things get busy, the performance was fairly stable. On the other hand, though, I honestly just think this rope mechanic was a dumb idea. I mean, a series that's all about high speeds, and you want to force players to lug another character along with them? There are two types of situations in this game. You'll be abruptly slowed down and have your progress halted by the other character, or watch as the other character, who is usually as fast as you are, flail about beyond your control as you desperately try and stop them from doing so. You are able to stop your partner in their tracks by pushing a button, but in my experience, that rarely solved the issue. In some cases, the partner also clipped through a wall and got stuck somewhere, completely blocking all movement. Thankfully, you're able to call the partner back with the push of another button, but doing so costs 10 rings. The game punishes you for its broken mechanics. In fact, if you don't have enough rings and use this feature, the game gives you negative rings. Yeah, negative rings. Also, I swear, the mechanics for flinging yourself only work when they feel like it. They nerfed the spin dash, so your only option to get up slopes with any real consistency is the fling mechanic. But of course, I say consistency in the loosest possible way. You have to be on perfectly flat ground to use it, because if you aren't, you'll gain absolutely no speed from it. Hell, sometimes it will flat out refuse to work for no reason at all. I mean, look at this. I'm using the mechanic properly, but the stupid characters just won't go up the damn slope. Can you see why I think this idea is just kind of fundamentally missing the mark? All it does is take control away from you and causes a whole bunch of shenanigans that never happen in the other Sonic games. Also, if your partner gets hit, something that's pretty much impossible to avoid because of how often they flail around and stuff, you'll still lose your rings. Sure, Tails could get in the way in previous games, but at least you weren't attached to him. At least he didn't abruptly fling you all over the place and lose your rings when you got hit. If you ask me, these are problems inherent to this Bungie gameplay, and personally, I don't see a way it could have been fun. Even pushing that aside though, there's still a truckload of baffling design decisions in this game. Sega must have known how broken this Bungie mechanic was, so the levels you run around are an absolute cakewalk to accommodate it. They have essentially nothing going on in them at all. I may have criticized Sonic CD's level design for similar reasons, but that game at least had some things going for it. Here in Knuckles' Chaotix though, it's a mishmash of slopes and randomly placed set pieces that offers very little in the way of challenge. The difficulty in this game doesn't come from the platforming, the enemies, none of that. It's all from the broken mechanics, which actively impede your progress and turn the most basic tasks into a complete nightmare. This easily gets my vote for the most boring and bland Sonic game I've yet played. So guess what they do? They gave each zone not 2 acts, not 3 acts, but 5 acts each, with very little variation between each individual stage. Sonic 1's 3-act zones may have become tiresome by the end, but at least most of them featured a few differences between individual acts to prevent complete monotony. Here in Knuckles' Chaotix, no such luck. You have 5 zones with 5 acts that each all play identically, making for 25 of the most soul-devouring stages in any game from the series, at least in my opinion. Thankfully, you aren't forced to play every zone's levels back to back to back to back to back. This game has a sort of hub world, which contains a roulette minigame where you semi-randomly pick a stage to play. Unfortunately, that's also how you select partners, with a stupid minigame. By default, you play as Knuckles, who can glide and climb as expected, but your partner has to be selected with a crane minigame. Most partners change nothing, but there's also Heavy and Bomb, who were intentionally put in to disadvantage you. Heavy is, well, his name says it all, and Bomb flies around like a madman and can apparently even blow you up, although I never saw that happen. Heaven help you if you get one of these two, because whichever partner you get is final and can't be switched out until you either die or beat a stage. Which, speaking of, this game also has bosses at the end of the 5th act of each zone. Most are bland and forgettable, but it was on one of them where I discovered another wonderful design choice this game has. If you die, which has the laziest animation I've ever seen, yeah, that summarizes the entire game right there. You're kicked back to the hub. No checkpoints, nothing like that. You'll have to re-roll for another stage. And guess what? With mechanics as busted as intrusive as this, you can potentially spend up to 8 or 9 minutes on a level, struggling in a fight against the mechanics and getting lost in the level design that looks the same from top to bottom. So if you die right at the end, you'll have to relive all that tedium all over again. But of course, that's hypothetical, because as I said, it's nearly impossible to die in this game because of how little the stages have going on in them. In fact, I only died once throughout all the miserable 2 hours and 47 minutes it took for me to beat this game. Even with that in mind, the mere idea of having to restart these levels and fight with your partner while trying to do the most basic things really grinds my gears, even if it never happened more than once. Thankfully though, there is a slight relief to all the tedium, and that's the different playable characters. If you exit the game, you're able to reload your save file and pick a different character. Knuckles is the default, and by that I mean he's the first one listed, but you're also given the choice of Mighty or the Chaotix. Which, by the way, because I have nowhere else to mention this, when you press start on the title screen, it straight up just looks like a debug menu. Just blank white text in front of the title scene. And straight up the options menu just looks like it was a developer debug tool. Pure effort, this game. Anyway, Mighty is pretty useless and not very mobile. Vector is alright with his air dash and wall climbing, and Espio has a neat jump animation with very little mobility as well. Best of all though is Charmy B, which is something I never thought I would say in my life, as you'll see in my later videos on this series. Here though, he's your lifeline. He can freely fly over everything, turning these already nothing stages into an even shorter affair. It gets even easier if you find a grow power-up, which turns you huge and makes you jump really high. As Charmy, this also includes being able to fly even faster. So you have the choice of being completely at the mercy of the bungee mechanics, or flying over the stages and beating them in no time. Well, relatively no time. Guess which one I picked. Even then, the stages still have things that get in the way. The shrink power-up turns you tiny and restricts your mobility, forcing you to wait 20 tedious seconds for it to wear off. That doesn't really affect Charmy's flight much, but still, it makes him go way slower. And having to play this game for any longer than necessary is a loss in my book. Hitting a swap monitor will also force you to play as your partner for several seconds, which can disrupt you from searching for a way out as Charmy. Additionally, there's these stupid large rings that appear in certain spots if you have enough rings, which send you to a pace-breaking bonus stage that controls like ass and drains your rings. Flying around as Charmy, it's possible you can run into one of these things by accident. You can thankfully exit them by hitting a special box, but that doesn't stop them from annoying the shit out of me. That may sound like a silly complaint to some, but you'd be surprised how much it can get in the way. This game, to me at least, is a series of things that just get in your way, except where the stuff that these things interrupt isn't any good either. Should I even talk about the special stages? To be honest, I don't even care. You access them like it's Sonic 1, where you have to bring 50 rings to the end goal and jump into the large ring that shows up. The special stages themselves take place in an abstract 3D environment that's extremely similar to that old browser game Run from coolmathgames.com. Yeah, remember that? If you do, you had a childhood. Anyway, you have to collect a bunch of blue spheres before your rings run out. Oh, what, you're waiting for me to say more about it? No, that's it. There's spike balls and other hazards all over the place in each stage, but unlike Sonic 2's special stages, I didn't find that the visibility was an issue here. Honestly, these are probably the best part of the game for me. Yeah, what's usually the weakest part of any Sonic game is actually, if you ask me anyway, the best part of Knuckles' Chaotix. What kind of jacked up game is this anyway? Beating one nets you a Chaos Ring, because I guess there's another set of 7 thingies that gives their user a bunch of power alongside the 2 others? Who cares? All they do is unlock a different ending screen anyway. Which, speaking of, this game has got to have one of the laziest endings to any Sonic game as well. After beating all the main stages, you come back to the hub, and Metal Sonic just engages you in a fight where you can pretty much fly over all his attacks anyway. Even the last phase, where he admittedly takes this cool looking red form known as Metal Sonic Kai, is really easy, even with the second phase's obnoxious fist attack. Much like the rest of this game, it just kinda makes me feel nothing. I got the bad ending, where Metal Sonic burns down the, well, wherever this is, and to get the good ending, I'd have to get all the 5 Chaos Rings I missed, which means playing and replaying stages until I get them all. Yeah, screw that. If you can't tell by now, I didn't particularly care for this game. I thought every level blended together and dragged on for an eternity. The game was beyond repetitive and only gets more soul-sucking the longer it goes on for, and on top of that, it has all sorts of shit in it that irritated the living hell out of me. Above all else though, it's built on a foundation of ideas that I think are fundamentally just not that good. The tug-of-war gameplay was a royal pain in the ass for the whole game, and in such a speed-centric series, I see no way that it could have worked personally. Sonic is a franchise that prioritizes controls, so a gameplay gimmick that takes that away from you, get out of my face with that nonsense. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh when I say that, but when a game leaves me with nothing but disdain to this extent by the time I finish it, what exactly am I left with, you know? I know this game has its fans, more power to them. If you genuinely enjoyed Knuckles' Chaotix, then that's great. I just don't. To be honest, I would probably rather play 8-bit Sonic 2 over this game. At least there I generally have control over my actions and don't constantly get flung all over the place beyond my control. This is another game I most likely won't ever play again. So, what about Sonic 3D Blast? It came out in 1996, the year the 5th generation was in full swing, which Sega entered with the Saturn a year prior. Because of this, 3D Blast served as Sonic's final offering on his console of origin, before eventually being ported to the Saturn when Sega would struggle producing a proper 3D entry for the series. It was developed by Traveler's Tales, the same company who would go on to make the LEGO games, the hidden gem that is the Toy Story 2 tie-in game, and even some Crash Bandicoot titles like Wrath of Cortex and Twinsanity. They're a decent studio that's produced some fairly solid, or at least high-profile stuff over the years. So surely Sonic 3D Blast will be at least decent, right? Well, upon starting it up, I have to note how impressive it is for the system it came out on. For real, we have a full FMV sequence on a cartridge to start us off. Now granted, it's compressed to hell and back and only lasts a few seconds anyway, but still. The actual visuals, on the other hand, leave a bit to be desired. I wouldn't call them bad, just not that appealing if you ask me. This game features pre-rendered graphics reminiscent of Donkey Kong Country, except without the color, detail, and life that made those games appealing visually. Sure, that may be a little unfair because the Genesis was more limited on colors than the SNES, but even from that lens, I don't find it very appealing to look at. What certainly doesn't help is the animations, which I just find really stiff in this game. Additionally, the game has an isometric perspective, which in layman's terms is a pseudo 3D environment that you view from an above diagonal angle. Think Super Mario RPG, or how you would draw 3D objects on a piece of paper in elementary school. It's neat how they got this to run at a smooth 60 FPS on the Genesis, but the actual visuals are kinda bland if you want my honest opinion. But hey, you know what isn't bland at all? The soundtrack. It has Jun Sonoi's fingerprints all over it, and if you played Sonic Adventure, many of the tracks should sound very familiar. Several songs from this game were remixed for that one, and while I personally find the Adventure versions to be superior, the originals are certainly no slouch either. The Saturn version also has its own CD quality soundtrack, but personally I've always been partial to the Genesis version. All the cards are on the table for this game to be fairly neat. However, it's not, if you ask me at least. At first it didn't seem so bad, but as I played further into it, it just baffled me more and more. Like with 8-bit Sonic 2, I gave up after about an hour and a half of playtime. The thing that immediately jumps out to me is Sonic's handling. I think it's beyond fucked. The Genesis only had a D-pad, so you're confined to using only 8 directions in a type of game that would really benefit from more than that. I get there really wasn't much they could have done about this, but still, it makes Sonic stiff beyond belief and a nightmare to control in general. I was thankfully able to map the D-pad to an analog stick on my emulator, but that doesn't change the fact that Sonic's movement is still pretty limited. Hell, even on the Saturn version, which lets you use an analog stick officially, this problem still exists. Now that on its own would be bad enough, but then you have the other fatal flaw of this game, the perspective. Honestly, after playing this game, I can see why Sonic Team made the choice to revert Sonic 3 back to a traditional side-scroller. Isometric platformers like this are, in my opinion, not a great idea. I mean, platformers are all about judging distance between gaps, which, to properly do, you have to be able to discern what the hell's going on. In an isometric game, though, it's ambiguous how far or close to something you are, because there's no depth perception. It all looks flat. This, along with Sonic's controls, turns the most basic jumps into a task and a half. I mean, look at these balloons in the stupid carnival stage, or these stone platforms in the second zone. I honestly don't give a shit what they're called. Certainly not helping matters is the utterly broken collision detection. I swear, you can hit an enemy or boss correctly, but will instead take a hit, and it's like, how the hell did that hit me? The bosses and these stupid snowmen and Diamond Dust Zone immediately come to mind. I swear to God, every time I would try to hit these bastards, Sonic would lose all his rings. Every fucking time. And it's all because of the perspective again. And guess what? This entire game is one big fetch quest. In each level is a locked goal ring. To clear the way into the next section of a stage, or move on to the next one, you have to wander around like a jackass, killing a bunch of enemies and collecting flickies. Now, this type of gameplay isn't doomed from the start, if you ask me. I love collectathon games, and have gone on record praising several of them, including Super Mario 64, which released the same year as 3D Blast, come to think of it. However, the difference is, those games are full 3D, and so navigation isn't a complete pain in the ass of them. It's actually possible to see what the hell you're doing. Meanwhile, here in 3D Blast, I'm not not very funny, I'm sorry. You'll spend minutes upon minutes combing through every stage searching for these damn things, because the visibility sucks donkey balls. If you actually manage to kill an enemy and pick these tiny ass birds up with the wonky control and collision, holding onto them is another task. God save your soul if you take a hit, because the flickies scatter all over the place. Yeah, because that's a fun design choice in a game where I can barely fucking move. It makes every level drag out for an eternity. I also gave Knuckles' Chaotix scorn for this same thing, but honestly, I think this game has it worse. Its levels last about 8 minutes each, but feel like 20. The levels are all padded up the wazoo with annoying gimmicks, like these disorienting spinning propellers in the second zone, or the icy rivers and slippery physics in Diamond Dust Zone. Yeah, that's right, this game has an ice level that does the exact thing which makes me hate ice levels when done, and the exact thing I praised Ice Cap Zone in Sonic 3 and Knuckles for not doing, that being atrocious slippery movement physics. I thought this game was a tedious nightmare, and it infuriated me to no end. Thankfully, there's a few shields in the game, as well as a decent amount of rings and extra lives. You have the traditional blue shield, the flame shield from Sonic 3K, and best of all, the yellow homing attack shield, which is actually the debut of the staple move from the 3D games. Although taking a hit makes you lose the ability, so you're essentially not allowed to use it for longer than, just do the math here, 10 seconds or so. How this wasn't a part of Sonic's base moveset when it really would have eliminated a lot of the frustration, I'll never know. Oh, and yeah, this game has special stages. In random points throughout each level, you'll come across Tails or Knuckles who, oh dear. Are they alive? They don't look so good. Should I be running right now? Well, no. They sit around demanding payment from Sonic in the form of 50 rings. Now, the best thing about this is, if you walk up to them before you have the necessary amount, they'll still take the rings away from you. This makes it so you just have to bring them 50 total rings, and not 50 all at once. So that's an improvement from Sonic 2's system, but still, they couldn't have just taken a fraction of your rings, and just left you with like at least one of them? Anyway, once you get past one of these greedy dirtbags, how are the special stages themselves? Oh, and I never got into another one of them after that, because, again, a horrible collision that constantly steals your rings. Not that I would want to, anyway. I swear to God, I jumped over those spiked balls, but the game just said, lol, no, and counted each jump, which, again, was clearly over the balls, as a hit. Also, after you get kicked out of the stage, just like the original Genesis version of Sonic 2, all your rings are taken away. That's great. Seems like this game's issues affect every single part of it, huh? Which, of course, includes the boss fights, and oh boy. I'm just gonna say it, these are by far the worst bosses I have ever faced in a Sonic game. And yes, that includes every Sonic game. It's all this game's fundamental issues imploding in on each other at full force. Broken and bullshit collision that causes you to take a hit despite seemingly hitting Eggman because of the awful perspective? Check. Things that randomly hit you anyway because why not? Check. Sonic's controls making the most basic movement a nightmare? Check. Worse still, you know another one of this game's amazing choices? If you can call it a choice. Well, getting hit causes your rings to scatter, right? A time-honored Sonic staple we're all familiar with by now. Except in this game, they fucked it up big time, because you want to know what happens. As if the perspective in Sonic's controls didn't make grabbing dropped rings hard enough, several of them just disappear. Blatantly. No, I'm serious. Look at the footage I'm putting in front of you. If I have 4 rings, for instance, then all 4 drop, but 2 just vanish for no reason. Can you even begin to comprehend how unbelievably obnoxious that is? So, not only do you have to deal with broken mechanics for these fights, your one safety net, the rings, just fuck out on you? What kind of design choice is that? If it even is a design choice. I mean, it might just be a glitch, I don't know. It can even happen when you have 1 ring. 1. You get hit, as you will in these fights, and then your soul ring just evaporates before your eyes before you even have a chance to pick it up. The boss for the Carnival Zone was already bad enough in this regard, but then you have the fight in Diamond Dust Zone. Eggman is able to freeze you if you aren't pixel perfect precise with your hits, at least it feels that way, and again, disappearing rings. This fight drained every last one of my lives, and since this game has limited continues and no save feature despite coming out 2 years after Sonic 3 and K, which had a save feature, that meant I would have to start over from square one. Once that happened, like with 8-bit Sonic 2, I gave up, because I have better things to do with my time left on this planet, however long that may be. I have not gotten this angry at a game in a long time. Not since I reviewed Size Matters and Agent Clank last summer. All in all, I was stunned by how much I hated Sonic 3D Blast. I had heard mixed things about this game over the years, but good fuck, I couldn't have imagined it would piss me off this much. I may have criticized 8-Bit Sonic 2 and Knuckles' Chaotix quite harshly in this video, but to be frank, I would take them in a heartbeat over this garbage. This is a new contender for one of the worst Sonic games I've ever had the displeasure of playing. I hate the controls, I hate the gameplay loop, I hate the mechanics, I hate the bosses, I hate the collision, I hate the level design. I hate this game. God damn, it's like I'm Roger fucking Ebert over here or something, but seriously. I couldn't stand playing this game, and within 30 minutes I was already irritated. Also, and I didn't mention this, but I started to feel legitimately sick while playing this. Especially in the god knows what it's called carnival level, with all the springs and bullshit spikes that pop up all over the place and fling you every which way. Ugh, makes me feel like I want to vomit a little bit. I don't suffer from motion sickness, and so rarely if ever experienced this feeling from a Sonic game, but 3D Blast just hit me in the right way. And yes, I am aware of the director's cut version created by the game's original programmer John Burton. That guy's a programming wizard, by the way, seriously. Go check out his channel Game HUD. While that's cool and all, I didn't play it because a lot of my issues with this game are on a fundamental level. I'm sure it's much better than the original, but most of the problems I have with this game are baked into its very core, so I'm not exactly compelled to play it, you know? Also, this video is getting way too long anyway for what it is, so I'd say it's not worth it. All I would probably have to say is that it makes some improvements, but ultimately isn't enough to redeem the game for me, because doing that would require making an entirely new one. But that's all I have to say about Sonic 3D Blast. I couldn't stand it. Others may disagree, but personally, this game gets the Razzie for me. I consider it the worst game I had to suffer through for this video. No disrespect to the people who made it or anything, I just didn't enjoy the game and felt it was filled to the brim with baffling design choices and flaws. But hey, maybe Sonic Blast will be good? Yeah, these games kinda sucked. I think I've been hammering that into your head by now, but really, with a few notable exceptions here and there, I didn't really like any of these games, and a few I just downright despised. Sonic had it rough in the platformer spin-off department during this era, and especially as the 1990s rolled along, I can only imagine how much it seemed like a worthy follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles was impossible to those invested in Sega back then. I wouldn't say this venture was a complete waste of time though, because if anything, I got to experience more stuff from one of my personal favorite game series, as ugly as it may have been at times. And hey, if anything, I discovered an alright first 8-bit entry for the series, and one of its most criminally overlooked titles, Sonic Triple Trouble. If I could recommend any games from this train wreck of a video, that would be the one, because it actually feels like a proper Sonic game despite the criticisms I gave it. If I can say anything though, avoid Chaotix, 8-bit Sonic 2, and especially 3D Blast like the plague. Or play them if you want, I guess. I won't stop you. And hey, if you ended up enjoying, or currently enjoy any game I harshly critiqued in this video, don't let that get you down. Everything I said in this video was just my opinion, so you aren't required by law to agree with it. But in any case, by the time the 1990s were coming to a close, people were losing trust in Sega. Numerous poor business decisions would cause them to bleed money, making it so their dominance over the video game market in the early part of the decade would begin to evaporate into nothingness. Nintendo once again ruled the roost, or at least they did, before a new threat looming over the horizon would make itself known. That of course being the Sony PlayStation. A new era was starting, that being the 3D revolution. But for Sega, oh man, if only they knew how bad things were. The launch of their entry into the new generation, the Saturn, was a complete disaster. The financial problems they experienced carried over from the latter portion of the Genesis' lifespan, and on top of that, a 3D Sonic game, which would have easily helped the console sell, had significant troubles, making it so such a game wouldn't end up materializing. Instead, Sega just ported 3D Blast to Saturn, as I said, and released a collection of the original trilogy. Things were not going well for them. However, they had a Hail Mary. One last console, kickstarting yet another generation before their competitors could. Complete with the true 3D Sonic game as a launch title. It was Sega's last resort. Their final attempt to rejuvenate their console business and leave an impact with their blue blur once again. Did they succeed? Well, that's a story for next time, where I'll be tackling a game that should be very familiar if you've been around this channel since I started doing this type of content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you then.